You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and federally certified veteran-owned small business. I'm your host, Robert Bain, along with our producer, Chris Spangle. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact us at chris@leadersandlegends.net. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. We are blessed today to have the fourth appearance by one of the most popular, brilliant, and hardworking historians on the planet. And that is Gareth Russell. He is the author of The Six Loves of James I. He has been on the podcast before to talk about Hampton Court Palace, the fizzy life of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, and, of course, our conversation about the Titanic, a gorgeous book about that particular tragedy. Mr. Russell, thank you for coming back.
No need to thank me. Thank you for having me. It's genuinely a pleasure every time.
We don't bury the lead here at the Leaders and Legends podcast. Who are the six loves of James I?
Yeah, there's always a question, because there's five obvious ones and then a sixth contested. So if I have to put my money on it, I would say they are Patrick Gray, who was a Scottish courtier with a side hustle in espionage. There was the Marquis of Huntly, who was sort of one of the great warriors and clan chiefs of James's time as King of Scots. There was Alexander Lindsay, who was one of James's lifelong friends, and later, and for a period, about 2 or 3 years, a lot more than that. I would actually include James's wife, Anna of Denmark, in the six. She is. It's not a field in which women are overrepresented, they're in terms of the numbers, but I would include his wife. It was an arranged marriage, but I think there was a lot of affection there. And then the last two are Robert Carr, who was a Scottish knight, who James was involved with for about 7 or 8 years, and then George, Duke of Buckingham, who I think is probably the most famous of those six. They were involved for a decade, and if any of the listeners saw last year the Starz TV series Mary and George, in which Julianne Moore played Buckingham's mother and Nicholas Galitzine played him. That's the last of the six. Some people would slot Anna out and put Philip Herbert in, but I don't think I think Anna has earned her place as one of the six.
Now, George, excuse me, Duke of Buckingham.
Yes.
Is he related to Barbara Villiers?
They are distantly related, yes. So Andrea Zivich, who wrote a great biography of Barbara called Ravenous, she was a mistress. Barbara was not Andrea. Barbara was a mistress, one of the most notorious mistresses of King Charles II, James's grandson. They are related. It's not a very close relationship, genetically. I think she's her great niece or something. It's staggered, but it's not direct. However, what is quite interesting is that good looks seem to gallop through the family, and a certain amount of very confident sex appeal. So yes, we have Charles I, who's the king between James and Charles II, doesn't take any mistresses. He's terribly unfashionable in being deeply in love with his wife. But it is interesting that the two kings in that, James the First and his grandson Charles II, they both were very heavily involved with members of the Villiers family.
The only reason I mention that, and we'll get back on task here, is when I read that part of your book, the Vane family.
Yes.
And that's us. That's me and my brood, my clan with a C. We are sorry, Gareth, go ahead.
Sorry, for a minute I didn't clock the specification there.
You're from the old side of the pond, so I had to be clear. Our family is descendant from Charles II through Barbara Villiers.
Ah, okay. Well then listen, good looks run in your family.
My
So
girlfriend and I went to Raby Castle last year when we were in
very good.
Scotland, and which is owned by the Vane family and has been for centuries.
Well, I would certainly. I wrote the full disclosure. I wrote the foreword for Andrea Zuvic's biography of her Ravenous, and it's a very good book. It's so it might be of interest for you, but it paints Barbara in all of her Technicolor glory and horror at the same time. But very and also I think Andrea's doing great stuff with trying to remind everyone that the Restoration period, the 1660s, the 1670s, they had more sex than the Tudors and only marginally fewer stabbings.
the
So
the
it has
the
everything you'd want.
Restoration Charlie, the Merry Monarch. You
Yeah,
had,
yeah.
well, you look at that just very quickly and you think, okay, there's a restoration in 1660. So this is just the way it's going to be. And the restoration didn't have to take. I mean, he could have been thrown off again,
Yeah.
or when James came to the throne, I think it was 1685. James,
Yes, in seconds, yeah.
then, they had the glorious revolution.
Well, I mean, you look at
It's not
some,
a foregone conclusion that everything starts from Charles II and rides through the Hanoverians to what we have now.
correct. I think you have to give Charles II credit and William III actually for being able to make difficult decisions to hold that ship on course. And we can look today at the Spanish monarchy has been restored and it has weathered quite a few storms, but there are many monarchies that come back. I'm thinking of France's being the most obvious.
Yeah.
That actually it's not a foregone conclusion that the revolution is buried just because of a restoration. So Charles II was a compulsive survivor, and I do think that from having worked in a biography of his grandfather, that is the Stuarts have they're almost two personalities that skip various generations. Some of them are ruthlessly pragmatic survivors, and the other half of the family tend to be almost attracted to tragedy and doom in the way a moth is to flames. And I think James's mother, Mary Queen of Scots, and his son Charles I fell into the doomed martyr category. And so did, I mean, right, I mean, to be honest, the dynasty was sort of buried that way with Bonnie Prince Charlie. There was that trait in all of them that they either flourished or failed, but they never did so quietly.
Did you, speaking of Bonnie Prince Charlie, have you
Yeah.
been paying attention to the archaeological dig at Culloden
I
or
haven't. No.
Culloden, I guess is
A
how you
lot,
say it.
yeah.
Culloden.
I haven't, although, funny, this is the second conversation today I've had about Jacobites, which is a much higher annual quote than my annual average. I'd be really interested to see. I mean, I think the Jacobites, I'd love for there to be a good big history of them because they're just to me it's fascinating and even I've been working on some stuff about set in late 18th century France and really like right the way up to the 1780s and the 1790s, like Jacobites are still quite prominent in that world. So yeah, I haven't kept my eye on it, but I certainly will because I sort of I have a feeling I'll become a lot more interested in it. It's one of those things you think once I start, I'll be fascinated.
Well, we're Catholic here, Mr. Russell, so we're Jacobites on the
You're
Leaders and
Jacobites,
Legends
yeah.
podcast. I'll send you the last article I read about it. Anyway, it prompted
Yeah,
me
please do.
to
I'd
ask
appreciate
you.
that.
Jacobites. Jacob is Latin for James, and so the
Yes.
Jacobites were the ones who continued to follow the Catholic branch of the House of Stuart, which was deposed in 1688. Uh, when you mentioned the six loves of James the First,
Yeah.
you mean loves and lovemaking?
Yeah, I do. I'm not a particularly coy. I've actually fairly limited patience with coy history. I think if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's not a cat. And I think when you have letters in which, James is saying, or sorry, the Duke of Buckingham is telling James he can't wait to feel his thighs and his arms again when they're talking about kissing and marrying each other and when James is kicking out all the other servants and insisting Alexander shares his bed and no one else. You have erotic letters where one of them seems to be is referencing, excuse me, acts of mutual masturbation. I think I can understand the concern from people about presentism and projecting things back, but homosexuality didn't come into existence when they aired the first episode of Will and Grace. Like it's been around for a very, very long time. And I think you have to be fairly clear-sighted about this, and at a time when the line between personal and political was non-existent, really, at the heart of these monarchies, or in society in general, to be honest. It mattered hugely that a king at this point at which, Britain as a concept comes into being, that these men are rising to positions of great prominence. It does matter. It's also fascinating. So I think quite early on, I was determined not to inflate evidence. And I think there have been st not so much of James, but there have been studies of, let's say, non-heterosexuals or questionably heterosexual historical individuals where that evidence has been inflated. But I do also think, to flip the coin, there are many, many cases when there is evidence like this about homosexuality or bisexuality, whatever nomenclature you want to use, where for some reason, some historians have put so many road bumps in front of it. They try to qualify it and they interpret it in ways that require intellectual athleticism in terms of how flexible you have to be. And it's Occam's razor. They're missing the most obvious thing. If a man writes to another man saying, tears were spilling down my face because you were not in my bed, it's not platonic. If James is writing to one of them, I would rather be banished to the ends of the world with you than live a widow's life without you. Again, it's very clear what it is. And listen, the Stuarts were not known for their love of sleeping alone. A low sex drive is not something you can credit the family with. So he was a very passionate man. The evidence for all of those six, I would say, is very, very strong. There are three for whom I would say it is incontrovertible, and three for whom it's very, very strong. So, for instance, to give an idea of one, that another biographer of James's from a few years ago, Stephen Verrippen, Stephen and I think that he slept with someone who Stephen doesn't think it happened with, and I don't think he did with someone Stephen thinks did happen. But for instance, the case that Stephen and I disagree over is the Marquis of Huntly.
Right.
And Stephen thinks that Huntley used the king's attraction to him to further his political agenda to re-establish his dominance in the Highlands. So there's the crucial moment that we have on record is that Huntley's accused of espionage. And when he's brought into James's presence, James, we're told by an eyewitness, kissed him to the astonishment of all there, repeatedly kissed him. And then Huntley asks to spend the night. James banishes all other servants, and the next morning says he's convinced he's innocent. So I'm not much of a betting man, but if I had to bet what they were doing between and the announcement of his innocence at breakfast, I could take a guess. Whereas Stephen thinks that Huntley sort of led James on a bit. I think it's probably more likely that something happened that night. But with Anna, Robert, George, Philip, Alex, and Alexander, I would say the evidence is overwhelming. And I didn't think that it would be with Philip actually going into it. My mind changed a few times about a couple of them. But it's remarkable from a really greedy biographer's perspective to have this amount of evidence about anyone's inner life from the late 16th, early 17th century is a real joy.
You do a really terrific job at the end of your book. You said a few minutes ago, you used the word nomenclature
Yeah.
of kind of describing the terms you use. Are they teleological? Are they, not fit for 2025, 2026? Why did you feel, talk just for a minute about why you felt compelled to do that?
Oh, it's a good question. Thank you. I think you owe it to the subject and perhaps more importantly to the reader. So the appendix at the end talks about the terminology, and I think there are valid concerns that words to describe same-sex intimacy carry with them the presentist weight, and that we'll be exporting the present to the past. And I think, like many readers of history, I've had quite enough of the present and would prefer that the past not be offered up on the altar of the present. So I understand that. And I wanted to engage with those concerns and to be fair about it. So I've said to you before, I have limited patience with coyness. And that also extends to engaging with some arguments about homosexuality that I think that use very little evidence to make it. And I'm a great believer that homosexuality should not be an exception within history. This homosexual exceptionalism that comes from both critics and proponents of incorporating it into history is equal parts misleading. So for me, the joy of writing about someone who was homosexual or bisexual is not that you make the whole story about them, it's that you restore a big part of anyone's life and you get to see all of them restored to it. So I was keen in the appendix to engage with valid reader concerns about nomenclature, is it justified? And also to explain the words I used, because there are some people coming maybe from the opposite perspective who want certain vocabulary to be used. And I have a moderate streak of independent defiance. And I picked the words I wanted to use to describe this. So I don't, for instance, describe him as gay, not because there's anything wrong with the word, but because it is a very modern term and it has cultural connotations. Homosexual, I do use when describing the act of it. Um, because I think, yes, okay, in the same way the word comes into existence in the 19th century, but unless you want me to write the whole book in early modern Scots, you're going to be using modern terms.
Sure.
So I think you engage with it honestly, you put out your market stall and say, this is why I'm selling what I'm selling. And above all, I think the appendix is about sort of extending a handshake to the reader and saying, I trust your intelligence. And I think there are far too many books that speak down to their readers and try to lecture them into agreeing with you. This is the evidence. This is how I spoke about it. Make up your own mind. And I hope you enjoy the book. That's sort of what that appendix was to the
But it,
reader.
but it's your belief. I'm going to put words in your mouth, so please take them out.
Sure.
No comprehensive, honest, and fair biography of James the First of England can be written without addressing, including, and understanding his need for physical male intimacy.
You're not putting inaccurate words into my mouth. I would completely concur with that. I do not think the arguments that try to present him as heterosexual or asexual are intellectually credible. And I do
And
not
it's
believe,
happened just real quick. It's happened recently with Frederick the Great, where Tim Blanning and there's Baron von Steuben here in came from Germany, but drilled the troops at Valley Forge in the United States. It's becoming a part of historical portraits, whether it's accurate or contrived or advocacy is kind of
yeah,
up to the reader.
yes, I think so. I think you have to, I mean, I think it was such a hugely important part of his reign that I do not understand. I certainly cannot look at at all the letters and the evidence, even the archaeological evidence of him constructing secret passageways between his bedchamber and the Duke of Buckingham's. And I recently was at the hall where it was, and what they had done to shield it. It was really extraordinary. But I can't understand honestly how you can look at the amount of evidence we have and how specific it is and reach the conclusion that it was platonic. I mean, I cannot. But I do understand, and that, listen, if someone said that James was heterosexual, I would think it was intellectually baffling. However, having worked in other topics of history where people think the Titanic was sunk on purpose, it wouldn't be the worst thing I'd ever heard. Um, I think luckily I've been fairly I have an armor. Plus, I think you can't get too upset when people disagree with you. That's part and parcel of the reader's life and the historian's job. But certainly, yes, you're right. I couldn't conceive of it as a credible or justifiable position from the documentation perspective.
Any
But
more
one
than you could do the same thing for Henry VIII's heterosexual.
Correct. And that's a great point, Rob, because what it does is it's linking it. You cannot, if you have letters where Henry VIII says he misses being in Anne Boleyn's arms, and you were like, well, they were just friends, you would rightly consider it a ridiculous thing. And that's sort of what I hope this book does as well, which is that it puts James back into the line of monarchs and individuals with all of his personality traits and needs and wants and foibles intact. One thing I will say that I hope we're getting to the end of is that really from about the 1990s onwards, so about 30, 20, a quarter of a century, let's say ballpark, maybe a little bit longer, there was a very pervasive view that began in academia and then moved out into popular culture, in which fairly obviously emotionally intense pieces of same-sex evidence from the past, it was considered intellectually superior to conclude it was platonic. They were just friends. That's how friendship was explained at the time. And that I it's very important when you're looking at, say, late 18th century writings, let's say between Marie Antoinette and the Duchess of Polignac, and they do look more emotionally intense than we might, but they're a long way from being love letters. And actually, when you really look at what love James's letters versus his letters to his friends are very different. And I hope we're reaching an end of this idea that there's some sort of intellectual superiority that is endowed on the historian who reaches any conclusion but same-sex intimacy. I think that produces questionable history. And the most important thing for anything like this is that you judge all evidence the same, that you're not trying to reach any position that has a 21st century lens or conclusion to it. That's my own take from having worked in this book.
How much, if any, in your view, is this discomfort?
Mhm.
Is this sort of Pavlovian drive to say, no, 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 they were
Yeah.
just friends? How much of that is influenced when you're discussing male relationships as to female
Ah,
relationships?
I would say it's actually more. Ooh, there is certainly a tendency. Female-female intimacy is a little bit trickier. The reason being is that there was a culture, for instance, of unmarried women taking in companions in a way that wasn't as common for men. Um, so there are sometimes there are difficulties with that. Um,
In other words, Marie Antoinette has a female lover who that's hot. Louis the 16th has a male lover.
that's
That's
gross.
that's
Yeah,
gross.
yeah. There's definitely yeah.
Even though the writing about Henry Louis the 16th, the male lover would have been in good shape because
Yeah,
apparently
sure, yeah.
he had some gifts.
It was yes, yes, yeah. It's yeah. It's that's interesting. Yes, I do think there is certainly an element to which male-male sexual intimacy also, particularly within monarchy, plays into concerns over power dynamics. That becomes a thing. So for instance, with James, there is very little pushback against the earlier lovers, say between him being about 17, 18 up until his early 20s. There doesn't seem to be that much concern. Only there's the pamphlets calling him the Buggerer King, and there are protests in Edinburgh when it is correctly surmised by the people of Edinburgh that James's latest romance is the reason he's delaying getting married. But they're very mild compared to what comes later. The bigger concern with James is really from about I would say 1612, 1613 until his death in 1625. He starts to become a little less healthy. He is drinking too much. He's suffering from insomnia. And the two consecutive lovers, Robert Carr and then the Duke of Buckingham, there is a concern that James is being dominated by them and that they are the dominant partner. They are the one who has access to the council chamber when they really should only have access to the bedchamber. So that there is definitely, I think, a certain sense of it's okay as long as the king is the one in control. That I do think does influence it.
One last question before we get on, and this may be way contrived, but before we
Sure,
get
sure.
on talking about James Stuart, the man, and
Yes.
how he shockingly survived.
Yeah, yeah, he
Because
would, yes, yeah. The odds were not in his favor.
no, they weren't. And again, feel free to say, Robert, this doesn't have anything to do with B. The controversy over Wallace Simpson in the late
Yeah,
1930s,
yes.
and the fact that King Edward VIII gave up his throne. Did that change at all how how scholars, historians looked at sex and power? I mean, a lot of people, if you read, and I read Alexander Larman's books, which are
Yes, yeah.
superb, they're
Yeah,
so good.
Alex is great. Alex is very good.
There seemed to be a movement of people who'd say, look, you can sleep with whoever you want, but you can't
Yeah,
become queen. In
right.
other words, the way you articulated a few minutes ago, boardroom or stateroom,
Yeah,
bedroom.
yeah,
Like
yeah,
just keep them away from how we run the
sure.
country and the power and giving
Yeah,
away of titles and this and that, and bang whoever you want, but we don't care. But what happened
right.
is that appeared to be the reverse, that had an undue influence on certain things. And I
I
just
don't
didn't know if Simpsons, if that whole thing changed how historians looked at
I
previous
don't think
centuries.
it could have. I don't know if it changed it so much as it validated it, if that makes sense. So with the 1936 abdication crisis, one of the reason why it became such a lightning rod for people's views were not just Edward and Wallace, but on the other side of the divide, George and Elizabeth, the future George VI, and then his wife, later his widow, was the Queen Mother. They are two very traditional choices. George is Air Force veteran. He's married Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. She's a member of one of the oldest families of the Scottish aristocracy. She's been a debutante in London. Her brothers all served in the Western Front. They are the conservative dream of a king and queen. And and they're very happily married. They have their two daughters. Edward and Wallace are sort of subversively modern. They're very Art Deco, cutting edge. They don't take duty as seriously as his younger brother and sister-in-law do. And Wallace is constantly making fun of the future Queen Mother for being fat and ugly. But actually, if you look at the way, and American magazines too, they're
her pudgy fingers are
her
all
pudgy fingers. Although I remember interviewing one of the Queen Mother's friends, and they had an absolute zinger about Wallace, and it was quick. And they said, "Oh yeah, she used to make fun of her pudgy fingers, but unlike Wallace, those pudgy fingers never shook Hitler's hand, did they?" And I go, "Well, there we are." And so, but Wallace also, I think, taps into, yes, this sort of concern of modernity, but also, without being unduly mean, I think the fact that Wallace was not a classical beauty also made people quite uncomfortable. And there was a lot of stories of her sort of almost emasculating him, and he was dreadful. I mean, Wallace is not in my canon of heroes, but if I ever felt sorry for anyone being stuck with a figure, I could find it in my heart to feel sorry for her having to live with Edward VIII. But yes, I do think that whole abdication crisis is a lightning rod for two very different views of family and love within monarchy. Very much so.
Wallace did Britain, Europe, and the world a tremendous favor.
Yeah,
Uh,
one of the Queen Mother's friends said to her once, he was like, if we were thinking about this clearly, we would have put a statue to Wallace in every town square in Britain.
you are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is historian, popular historian, and by popular, I mean best selling and beloved because he's phenomenal. And that's Gareth Russell. He was educated at Oxford University and Queen's University, Belfast. He has been on three other times. He has discussed his books, The Ship of Dreams about the Titanic, The Palace about Hampton Court Palace, and Do Let's Have Another Drink, a book about Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. We are discussing his new book, which is The Six Loves of James the First. Let's talk about James the First. Who
Yeah.
do you think was the first person to truly love him?
Ah. Well, I think the first person to truly love him was a much older woman called Lady Mar, his childhood governess. She looked after his mother, Mary Queen of Scots, was deposed and driven into exile when he was a baby. His father was assassinated. He becomes king, still
How
in
old
his
was
grave.
James when he became king?
James is crowned at 13 months old. He's James the 6th, King of Scots. And obviously that means that his uncle, Lord Murray, takes the reins of power. Because obviously when you're having to be toilet trained and learn how to speak, it doesn't leave a lot of time for state documents. And he's sent I've spoken about this before, but gorgeous, wonderful Stirling Castle, halfway between Edinburgh and Glasgow, roughly. And he's put into the care of the Countess of Mar, who is from good royalist stock. She's not to be messed around with. And she takes her duty of running the household and looking after the boy king very seriously. She sleeps in his room till he's 10. And one of the things I discovered researching that chapter in the book, to gallop through his childhood, he called her Lady Minnie, and I couldn't figure out what that was because her name was Annabella, so it wasn't an obvious nickname. So looking through some extremely dusty old notes and colloquialisms in Scotland and the northeast of Ireland, and it turns out Minnie in James's lifetime meant mommy. So he sees her as his mother to all intents and purposes. So I think she is the first person who really loves him. In terms of when he's older and he's an adult and a romantic love, I would say of the six, we actually get to number three before one of them loves him back equally, and that is a long-standing friend of his called Alexander Lindsay. He calls him Sandy. He was born in his family's manor at Sandyford. Sandy's also a nickname for Alexander. There's allegedly a legend that his hair was sandy colored, but I think we have enough anyway, there are three reasons he could have been called Sandy. And the reason why I sort of think of Sandy as one of the heroes of the book is, unlike most people in late 16th century politics, he's just a fundamentally good man. And him and James had gone hunting together as teenagers, and then when they're in their early 20s, about 21, 22, their friend Lord Hume sort of lets it out of the bag that things have moved on from just being good bros into something a lot more. And Sandy, sorry, the reason I think it was love was that when James was 16, he was kidnapped. And at great risk to himself, this is before anything kicks off romantically, but Sandy was smuggling letters out of the palace to nobles who James hoped would help him. He risked his life for him. He stayed loyal to him even when the head of his clan didn't. And without giving too much away, when the time comes for James to sort of fall on his sword and get married for the sake of the monarchy and the peace of Scotland and the next generation through the royal succession, Sandy does the right thing. Sandy does the noble thing and doesn't make it harder on him. So I think the first person to love him was his childhood governess, but the first adult to love him in a romantic way, I think, was probably the third person that James had strong feelings for, which was Sandy Lindsay.
James the First was born in 1566. He died in 1625. He reigned as King of Scotland from 1567 to 1625, and is the first Stuart King of England from 1603 to 1625. And we'll discuss King of Great Britain here before the conversation has completed. In your view, before he becomes King of England, so pre
Yes.
1603,
Yeah.
how many times legitimately was James's life in danger?
I don't know that many. So he's James the sixth at this stage,
Mhm.
and he says himself the first time he was still in the womb. His mother was pregnant and she watched as one of her advisors was murdered by her husband in front of her. And when she tried to intervene, one of her husband's allies pinned her back and pointed a loaded pistol at her pregnant belly. So James said himself later in life, I was baptized in blood. And, but I think, if I'm looking at it legitimately, there's the time that incident. He's kept fairly safe as a child. If we count the kidnappings, the brawl, the poisoning attempt, the attack on the palace. I mean,
I
off the
love
top,
this. This is so British. The poisoning and the
yeah, I'm sort of, and then, oh, sorry, yeah, the locked door. Yeah, I'm probably undershooting here quite a bit, but let's say there are by 1602, 1603, there have been at least 10 moments where it was seriously at risk through violence. But then sometimes I think, there are probably moments where you think, of course he wasn't at risk, but he didn't feel that way. So there are definitely, he would probably put the number a lot higher, and we could meet somewhere in the middle. But 10 off the ballpark 10. But there's not an encouraging family record here. His grandfather, James V, is the only Scottish monarch since Robert III to die of natural causes. James the First, Second, Third, Fourth, and Mary, Queen of Scots have all died violently. So James is, and also the Reformation is happening. It's a chaotic, brutal time, and James is exposed to it quite early. You don't have to be much of a student of psychology to imagine what this would do to a developing mind. But when he's 8 years old, he sees his grandfather, Lord Lennox, shot in a skirmish, dies. He's carried past James dying, and then when he's 11, he he sees one of his childhood playmate, one of his classmates, a guy called Archibald Erskine, is killed in a brawl, and James is in the corner of the hall, like ripping out clumps of his own hair, screaming for them to stop. So he is baptized and insulated in blood and violence. So I think the number of times is really interesting, but I think it's always the shadow of death is over him. And I wonder, this is pop psychology, so it's speculative, but that's part of the joy of conversations rather than writing. There's a really interesting psychology that happens after the Black Death, and we do have at the same time, things like the emergence of Our Lady of Sorrows and much more graphic crucifixes of Christ in his death throes as a response to the trauma they've gone through. But at the same time, society also becomes there's a lot more banging, there's a lot more drinking, there's a lot more partying at the same time. There's a almost merrymaking reaction to the morbidity and the horrible stuff that they've seen. And so James, I think there's an element to which, the drinking and the partying and the way he loves very passionately, I think the bright colors of how he lives is in part a reaction to the fact that for his first 30 or so years, he lives under the constant threat of assassination.
You mentioned his mother, both his mother and his father. His
Yes.
father was blown up in a
Yeah.
castle,
Yeah.
deservedly so. I'm sorry.
Yes.
Did I say
Yes.
that out loud? I'm sorry.
Yes. It's the only thing everyone agrees on in 16th century Scottish history. Darnley's gotta go.
Mary, Queen of Scots, James the Sixth's mother, is a
Yes.
famous sort of tragic figure in history without
Yeah.
changing subjects per se. Does A, she deserve that sort of reputation? And B, just personally, as a historian, as a person,
Yeah.
you have signed Mary, Queen of Scots' death warrant.
Oh, to begin with first, yes, she does deserve that reputation. Mary is a character with sharper edges. I had a very interesting experience working on this book. Firstly, trying to condense Mary's story into one chapter at the start was a challenge, but also seeing her from her son's perspective when she was in exile before she was executed. On the one hand, the first chapter did make me feel much more sorry for her than I had been before, and to have a lot more admiration for her for what she endured. The later chapters, thinking in particular, sort of chapters 4 and 5, when you see her sort of off stage, if you like, when she's still under house arrest in England, I discovered sharper edges to her, and um, I could see why so many people, including eventually her son, did not trust her. I think a lot of the lies that she told or the moves that she pulled in those years were born of desperation. She could see her life fading away from her under house arrest. I certainly cannot judge Mary for some of the steps she took to try to free herself when no one was helping her but herself to be freed. And that brings me sort of to your second question of I think people will be surprised at the Mary in 4 and 5, and it's not written negatively. I had great sympathy for her, but I could understand why some people reached the conclusion that they couldn't trust her. Um, with the death warrant, I fully believe after this that Mary did give the wink, the nudge, and the nod to Babington, Anthony Babington, in his plot to kill Elizabeth of England and make Mary queen. I think she did know that it would involve Elizabeth's assassination. So I can't really blame Elizabeth for being convinced by the evidence. I think that was a reasonable conclusion for Elizabeth to make. But Mary had also been in prison for 18 years, and I sort of think,
How could a monarch of a rival
right.
country be condemned for treason?
Well, that I mean, I can listen. I think had
Sounds
Elizabeth,
contrived.
it does. I think listen. I think she did it. Um, but yeah, I think legally it was beyond questionable, and I think Elizabeth knew that, and I think to give Elizabeth credit, I think she was really instinctively horrified by the prospect of Mary being accused of treason. I think she would have agreed with you. But
Wait a second. I want to make sure we're clear here. She would have agreed with Susanna Lipscomb because she's the one who brought your friend Susanna Lipscomb, who
yes, yeah, wonderful.
brought
Yeah,
that up to me when I did a podcast with her. And her point was, well, if you're going to kill her, but you can't execute her for treason, she's the Queen of Scotland.
yeah, that was so I think Elizabeth, there had been a law passed the year before that was the Act for the Surety of the Queen's Person, and it was the trap that Walsingham, I think, let Mary walk into. And Elizabeth had done everything before to it's not treason, you can't accuse her, she's a princess. And this is what got her. It was if you were next in line and you agreed to anything that might damage the sovereign's life, you could be tried for treason. The problem was the loophole becomes even weirder, which is that while Mary considered herself next in line, so Mary should have thought the law applied to her, Elizabeth hadn't named her next in line. So it was all, I think, listen, it was Mary's Gotta Die is the position
It's
of
a
a lot of,
great title of a book.
yeah, Mary's Gotta Die, 1586. I think Elizabeth lost control of Parliament and public opinion. And I think she never fully recovered from signing the death warrant. Would I have signed it? I don't think so. I suppose the difficult thing would be, am I going to accept that Mary has to be kept under even tighter conditions for the rest of her life? Do I move her to the Tower of London? I think for Elizabeth, that was very difficult because it had, understandably, I don't think she wanted Mary to be compared to her mother, Anne Boleyn. I think there
Sure.
was a lot of pain there. But I think if I was Elizabeth or as a quasi-absolute monarch, I wouldn't want anyone to think I could be railroaded this way into making a decision I didn't want. I think I'd want to push back against Parliament. And I also think that Mary the martyr is potentially much more deadly than Mary the prisoner. That would be my instinct. But I do believe Mary was complicit in the Babington plot. I do think Elizabeth was a remarkable woman, an extraordinary leader, but even the greats make mistakes, and when they make mistakes, they're usually big ones. I think whatever happened at the tail end of 1586, it felt like a runaway train that Elizabeth couldn't control, a bit like the start of the First World War. So I can't say exactly what I would have done in that position, but my instinct would be, from both a moral and a pragmatic perspective, signing it was wrong.
How old was James the First the last time he laid eyes on his mother?
He was 10 months old. They met at Stirling in April 1567, and then Mary was deposed not long after. They never saw each other again. They did, under the influence of one of his relatives, the Duke of Lennox, they did start writing to each other more often when he was a teenager.
But I was getting ready to
That,
ask you about that exact their relationship in letters because they didn't
yeah,
know each other in person. Did he ever see his dad? Did he ever see Darnley?
they saw, I mean, maybe a
Ever
handful
in
of
the
times.
same room?
So Darnley came into the room after he was born. He was at the parties for the christening, but he didn't attend it because he was annoyed
But
he wasn't.
that's
That's it. That's it.
so James of Scotland uh,
Yeah,
grew up without a mother, without a
yeah,
father, as you mentioned, other relatives, other favorites executed or died
yeah,
early. But speaking of brilliant historians, along with Mr. Russell, a few weeks ago, or maybe a month or so, we were lucky enough to have Tracy Borman on the
oh,
podcast
I love Tracy.
for the third time. Tracy Borman, OBE. We're very happy for her over here in Indianapolis, Indiana. And we discussed her book, The Stolen Crown,
Yeah,
which is
great book.
beautiful. Uh, she details some of the relationship between James and Mary, Queen of Scots. You
Yeah,
do it as well in your book. And it's through letters. They never met. James never
yeah.
tried to go see. Of course, she tried to get out of the castle. But why did their relationship was co-signed to or to just writing?
It's politics, really. So partly around young nobles, I mean, influential figures in Scottish politics who had been intimately involved and prominent supporters of the coup that overthrew Mary. So, in terms of finding support to go to see her, there would have been almost none. I think the second concern was less reasonable, but his grandfather had certainly refused to visit England in case he was taken prisoner or held hostage there. Politely, but held. Elizabeth, I don't think would have done that, but you can't, it's not a risk you necessarily want to take. I wonder, was there something psychologically comforting for James in not seeing her? I think, did that make it easier to, he was her replacement, not her successor. That's a very different thing. And I also think that public opinion, people forget this, Scottish public opinion was still very much against her. And there was a widespread belief, right or wrong, that she had murdered her husband, James's father. So he would have been wading into a minefield for nothing more than satisfying emotional curiosity. And I don't think there were any good reasons beyond that to do it. It also would have been hugely expensive. And I mean, he was 20 when she died, and he had only seized full control of Scotland's government himself in his own coup when he was 17. So really there had was not a huge amount of time when he could have, between 17 and really when the case against her kicks off, he's 19. So let's say there's those 2 years, and also he's just seized control of the Scottish government. So leaving it for a few months jaunt to England, where he may or may not be detained by Elizabeth to visit his hugely unpopular mother, it is political suicide. He might have a government to come back to if he left at that stage.
Get the sense that he was scared to meet her in the
Yeah,
sense of if I see her face to face and she touches my face and she cries and she only wants to be helpful and let me come back and all, that he would not have been able to resist her.
probably. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. I think James in person was a very emotional man. And he could be, I mean, James's temper was not something to trifle with, and he had very firm ideas of what his role in the world was. But he also was someone who could be, as many of us can be, face to face. It's a lot harder to be firm. So I would definitely not bet against that being part of the underlying reason.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. We're discussing his new book with author Gareth Russell. The book is called The Six Loves of James the First. Every woman who is either powerful, and that's not true. Let me say it a different way. All too frequently, a woman who is powerful or smart, independent, however you want to compliment her, and I say those words as a compliment, during this time period, they're either a witch or a whore.
Sure.
I mean, I can't think. Elizabeth the First was a whore. Mary Queen of Scots, they're
Yeah.
getting screamed at by the, obviously Marie Antoinette later on,
Yeah.
but they go through these crowds and they're getting screamed at and they're insulted. And the power of women was obviously not what it is today. But I would argue and would like for you to tell me I'm mistaken. The sexual power of women
Yeah.
was just as strong then.
Yes, I think there's
In some
certainly.
ways, because it's really, in some ways, it's all they had. And how did this sort of sexual prowess, this fear, this Eve and the apple thing, lead to what I think is a really strong part of your book? And that's and as someone who's been to Salem, Massachusetts, really strong part of your book when discussing the witch hunts. Why
Yeah,
did
the
why did James, why did the Stuarts seem to be, and as you detail,
yeah,
James kind of gets away from it, but why did they find this sort of witch hunting and these accusations so attractive?
the world is sick in his lifetime. It's nothing's going right. The climate is horrendous in the 1580s and 1590s. I always try to remind myself and people this is a subsistence economy. If the weather is bad and the harvest is bad, people will die. There is no backup. So feeble summers, brutal winters, that are unusual. They can't figure out what's causing them. 1517, the word Christian changes. It used to be everyone knew what it meant. All of a sudden, it changed. All of a sudden, half of Europe, Catholics are no longer Christian, according to Protestants. They rediscovered it in 1517. They know what Christian is. For Catholics, these are rampaging heretics. For Protestants, these are servants of the devil. They believe that as Christianity is shattering around them, in Christianity, there are two forces. There is God and the devil. And so they believe that
Mm.
Satan is prowling the earth, but he must have minions to help him. So there are many men who are accused of being necromancers, but the witchcraft accusations against women, it takes a lot of those stereotypes. I mean, they do go out, it's not true they only go after sort of social pariahs or older women. That does happen. And I think what we do in our society with older women is still something we kind of roll the millstone of reputations over them. They're either cuddly or dragons. And that does play a big part in it, but it's really this cauldron of things that come together in the 1580s and the 1590s. And I think, I mean, I go it in chapter 8, it's very kind of you to say you enjoyed it. In chapter 8, where I talk about the North Berwick witch trials, which are about 100 years before Salem, one of the things that really surprised me, and I made sure to share it with readers, was that there were no mass witch hunts in the British Isles at any point in the Middle Ages, and we think of them as a medieval phenomenon. And in fact, they are a post-Reformation phenomenon. I think the world feels sick for both Protestants and Catholics, and they are looking for the force in the darkness. This is another really, I don't want to say tangential, but it's about the lived experience of the past. A couple of years ago, I was giving a talk at Hever Castle, which is the old Boleyn family home in the south of England.
Gorgeous.
Absolutely stunning. I cannot recommend it enough. But I was staying nearby. I ended up missing my taxi. That part of England, there's no Uber. If you miss the taxi, that's it.
Go see Chartwell.
Yeah, yeah.
Alexandra take care, or Catherine
Yeah, yeah, it's really
Carter will
close.
take
And
care of
actually,
you.
yeah, they have a brilliant Catherine who takes care of that. It's brilliant. It's a brilliant spot, but it was pitch black, and I had to walk a mile, which was very stupid along country lanes. But anyway, I had to walk back to where I was staying, um, and
Through that little field, because
through.
when we went there, we got off the bus or whatever, the train, and you have to walk the field to
Yeah,
Eber
yeah, no, no,
Castle,
no. I know, yeah, exactly. No, no.
and you feel
Usually,
like you're some sort of crusader or something,
yeah, yeah.
about
You
to
come down the hill to
besiege.
the castle. Yeah, it's wonderful. No, it was out. It was past the field and then to the right. But going along that country lane, because usually I would stay at Hever, but it was fully booked then, so I was in an inn, a 20-minute walk away. But in the dark and at night and with the wind blowing, in that level of dark, your mind plays tricks. Like I did think I heard things in the field, or I did think I heard people behind me. And I think, in a pre-electric society, you hear the wind moaning and you hear the storms. And I think you could easily convince yourself in that world of shadows at night that there is something malignant out there. So I think it was it was situational in every sense of the word. And I also think it's still true that we'd rather say the reason things are bad is X, not there are 30 reasons why things are bad. So I think that's the human condition, to be honest.
We mentioned Eber Castle, which we must follow up by
Yeah,
saying how terrific. And I did a podcast with them, but Owen Emerson and Kate McCaffrey are
yeah,
uh,
brilliant.
they're so generous, so kind. It's a beautiful place. If you can pair that with a trip to Chartwell,
Yeah,
please do
yeah, yeah.
so.
Do we? I was at a press launch for Hever a year or so ago, but Winston Churchill used to go over and visit the Astors there, and he painted. And Hever have just bought a painting that Churchill did of Hever when he was at Hever, and some of the
Oh,
Chartwell team were over for it to be delivered back to the castle, which I thought was really, really very special to be there and very lovely.
we have a few more minutes left with Gareth Russell. I want to talk about two or three things in our
Sure.
time remaining. The next one is you mentioned her before. I
Uh,
loved reading her name because Anna is my daughter's name.
ah,
And what role did Anna of Denmark, popularly known as Anne of Denmark,
yeah.
but Anna of Denmark, what role did she play in his life? He seems, as you mentioned, I mean, he had a an affair or two. Nothing like many of the other Stuarts. And I thought that was
Yeah.
a terrific point you make in the book about the previous Stuart kings having all these lovers and all these
Yeah.
bastards, and then it creates all these problems. And so, other than giving the king several healthy children, how did Anna of Denmark shape the kingship and the man?
Well, firstly, great name for your daughter. I loved Anna of Denmark, and this, to be honest, I sort of fell a bit in love with her. She's so impressive. She's just ruthless and charismatic, and she knows what she wants. And she's the daughter of King Frederick II of Denmark and the sister of Christian IV. Her mother, Queen Sophia, founds her own bank. She comes from a family of heavy hitters, and Anna has, I've written about the Queen Mother before. They have a similar gift in that they can work a crowd, and they know that actually with monarchy it's best foot forward. And that's not one of James's strengths. She's an extremely shrewd and dispassionate analyzer of people. She often keeps them on the right tracks. She reminds them to be a bit more skeptical at times. I said once, and I stand by it. It wasn't a passionate love. If you read the letters to one another, it's a friendship, and they do their duty. They lie back and think of Scotland, Denmark, and England and have the children. But the friend that's really, really made each other laugh. And while it's not passionate, it is a real love in its own way. And she dies 6 years before him, and in the absence, I think she was his best ally, by a country mile, his best ally and advisor. So she's one of the stars of the show, and deservedly so.
I mentioned a few minutes ago Tracy Borman's book, The Stolen Crown,
Yes.
which we did a podcast interview with her, and she was, of course, brilliant and engaging and generous as always. This is your chance. Did James the Sixth steal the crown?
He steals it in the way Tracy presents him stealing it, which is that it was an inside job with Elizabeth, and that essentially Elizabeth did not want James, didn't want anyone to be her plus one in the monarchy. She said that having your successor name was like weaving your own funeral shroud, and she could use it to keep James on a tight leash. But as Tracy says, it was an inside job. She did not put any obstacles in his way. She could have if he misbehaved. And technically, this is where I sort of part company slightly. Under the terms of Henry VIII's will, James did steal it. The next in line was not him. It was one of the daughters of the late Earl of Derby. But I think Henry VIII's will was a ridiculous thing that was patently illegal, and that he had absolutely no right whatsoever to suddenly claim that the children of his younger sister should succeed over the older one. That's not how it worked. So yes, under the terms of Henry VIII's nonsense will, James did steal it, but Henry VIII stole everything else he ever came into contact with, so we'll not get too hung up on it.
Badly, if at all.
Yeah.
Did James the Sixth want to be James the First?
Very badly. He said he used to have nightmares that somehow Elizabeth would outlive him and he'd never get his hands on the English and Irish crowns. And, he was ambitious and he wanted to see all of the British Isles ruled by one person for the first time in their history, and he very much wanted that person to be him. And also the English monarchy, just because of the way land was divided and the fact that it had been quite stable for a long time, where Scotland's hadn't, the income he would have would be a lot higher in London. And he liked to spend and party. So, from both personal and frivolous reasons, he wanted to be James the First very badly indeed.
As a historian, do you, I could say, agree with his accession? But if you could wave a magic wand in
Yeah.
1603, would he been the one you would have
Yeah.
chosen?
100%. I think all the others were lightweight non-entities, and that it was so clear in terms of bloodline, which is how they determine most things, that he was the senior living descendant of Henry VII. Um, and also, I think elevating the other claimants like Edward Seymour or Arbella Stewart or some of the Derby girls, they would not have been able to carry the country. I mean, England was inherently conservative, and I think Arbella, Edward, or the Darbys, they would not have been able to carry all of the other great families with them. In many ways, the only way to unite them was to have someone come in from the outside at that stage.
And
Uh,
they very smartly recognized
yeah,
this.
Yeah, I think the fact that Arbella and Edward and all of them bent the knee immediately, so did the Church of England. I think from their perspective, it was a done deal that James was the most logical choice, the safest choice. He also, by this point, he's in his 30s. He has successfully held the government of Scotland. He's restabilized the Scottish economy. He's crushed political instability in Scotland. He has an heir and a spare with his boys. He is married to one of the wealthiest and best connected princesses in Europe. He checks a lot of boxes. And look, the English aristocracy were very aware of where James's tastes lay. There's a remarkable surviving list made by the Countess of Suffolk of what James found physically hot versus physically not in a prospective boyfriend. So they were aware of that, but they didn't overly care. On all the main criteria, James the Sixth was the ideal candidate to become James the First, rather than Arbella the First or Edward the Seventh. And bear in mind, sorry, Henry VIII's own children had disregarded some of the terms of his will. So I think, yeah, I think it was James by on every metric.
That you led me to my next question is, did his, I guess, is it fair to call it bisexuality? Would that be a
Whatever, yeah,
most
sure.
accurate term? His bisexuality was not a secret, not
No,
only,
no.
not just in his own household, but throughout the realm, throughout the island. Did that, you just mentioned that they didn't care, but did they really not care?
Most of them didn't. People of the past are no less intelligent than we are. If you have the sight of the King of England kissing the neck his male companion, you'll get 2 plus 2 and it'll equal 4. The one thing I would say that I try to remind people of is in some perhaps more Puritan communities or smaller communities, the knowledge of what homosexuality was not there, or at least it wasn't discussed. And there's something almost touching reading the accounts of people from those communities when they encountered James and them trying to make sense of what they were seeing through the lexicon they had. So there's a very, very sweet lawyer from the countryside who, when he sees James and Robert Carr, says the king and the earl were hugging very seriously when he saw them. And then there was another one that said, the king seems to have confused their sex and treats them as a woman. They didn't, but the quote that probably for me was the godsend, or at least was really interesting in sort of just reminding people not to condescend about the people of the past, was a writer called Francis Osborne. He actually at one point worked for the family of one of James's lovers. And it's an assessment that comes from a brilliant mind. And Osborne writes he of the king's love or whatever else posterity shall please to call it. And he goes on to say that it will be for future generations to come up with a word to describe how James fell in love with men because they don't have the perfect word for it. So I thought that was a real testament to Osborne's understanding that the language was still developing. But they did. The vast majority of them knew. There were plays making fun of it in London,
Mm-hmm.
at the time, and some not very nice poems.
Sermons.
Yeah, the sermons were harsh. The sermons were less funny than the plays. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not, and even in Parliament, when they're trying to criticize James, they use very like dog whistles, and some of
Sure.
them are subtle. But like, there's one, the Parliament is being asked to rectify some of the debt that the Stuarts have inherited from the Tudors. And the Member of Parliament for Yorkshire compares it to refilling a cistern. And he says, why would we refill this when the king drains it through a private cock? They really they go as close to the wind as possible. You can sort of imagine the poor Speaker of the House, whose job it was to moderate the language, knowing that he'd been outmaneuvered. But yeah, it's the least well kept secret in England.
We talked about, and I know our time is coming to an end. We talked for a few minutes about the dangers to James. If you could take just a minute or however long you want, because
Sure, sure.
it's evening in Ireland and it's just 12 o'clock here in the States. Uh, the gunpowder plot.
Yeah,
How did that change James, or did it not? In the
it did.
latest of attempts on his life and to
Yeah,
delegitimize who he was as a monarch.
it does change him, or at least it shocks him because it happens 2 years after he becomes King of England. And he says himself that he and Queen Anna thought they were safe. He talks after the gunpowder plot is foiled, he talks to Parliament about how God had saved him. in Scotland from the noose and the poisoner and the knife many times. And I think when he came south to England, he believed that he was safer and that almost he had survived. The survival was a done deal. And then the greatest risk, it would have been one of the most large-scale terror attacks in British history, in European history, had it gone off. I mean, they did like a recreation at some point to sort of see how far the damage would have been. They would have taken out the king, the heir to the throne. They would have taken out the entire governing class, all of the bureaucracy, and all of the government records. Actually, what would have happened afterwards would probably have been chaos on a scale that's hard to imagine. But for James, it is like someone was almost literally going to open the trapdoor to hell and let the flames burst through the earth. I mean, it was horrifying. And some really interesting accounts I found from diplomats, foreign diplomats stationed at court. The Republic of Venice's ambassador was especially interesting, where he says the king is in terror. And what he does is he shuts himself off in his room for weeks and he will only be served by Scottish servants. And I think, as I say in the book, I think he preferred England to Scotland, but he preferred the Scottish to the English. And the gunpowder plot accelerates that. And later, the terror recedes, and he starts attending church on the anniversary of the 5th of November every year to give thanks where it's due for his remarkable deliverance. And he does later incorporate it into this view of himself as a monarch preordained by God to be safe, and that actually these attempts to kill him are God showing the world how important James is. But for the first, say, 6 months after the attempt to kill him through the gunpowder plot, it decimates his mental equilibrium.
Previous historians have come on. I've asked them this question or talked about how this is the book that I would like to write, and I'll get your opinion
Sure.
on this. And I may have asked you this 3 years ago when we first met via Zoom. What do you think is the most impactful premature death in English British history? And could you make the case that it is Prince Henry, the Prince of Wales, the son of
Yeah,
James the First, and Anna of Denmark? I mean, there's
it's
lots. See, there's other ones. There's the Black Prince.
Edward
There's
VI.
Prince.
Yeah.
Then there's the William Atheling who dies on the
Yeah,
White
yeah,
Ship.
yeah, he's another big one. Edward VI, Henry the Eighth's son's another huge one.
You
It
can even
could be.
argue. You can even argue Frederick, Prince of Wales, who dies, and then George the Third
Yeah,
becomes
yeah,
king. And
yeah,
how would
yeah.
that
It
have
could be.
changed? But anyway, Prince Henry, he was thought of. I have a book about him. I haven't read it yet. He was thought as a Renaissance,
Yeah,
brilliant,
yeah.
perfect. This is the guy. He's got everything you could possibly want, and then he
He's the
dies.
most, yeah, he dies at 18 of typhoid. I will say, not to detract from the tragedy of Prince Henry's death in 1612, which I described in the book, it was heartbreaking, and his parents' reaction, his siblings, it was painful. I liked Henry a lot less after writing this book. I thought he seemed like a little bit of a nightmare, to be honest. But Henry's usually held up as the great what if because if Henry had become Henry the Ninth, we wouldn't have had Charles the First. We therefore almost certainly would not have had the Civil War or the Wars of the Three Kingdoms as they're known. It might have been out of the frying pan and into the fire, to be honest, because Henry the Ninth to be was militantly Protestant and was completely convinced by the lobby at his father's court, led by the Earls of Southampton and Pembroke, who really wanted the emerging British state to take its place as the dominant military Protestant power in Europe. And almost without question, nothing is inevitable. But very likely, when Henry became king in 1625, I think he would have involved Britain in the 30 Years' War in a heartbeat. And I also think he was so charismatic and strong and a very gifted warrior that Parliament would have given him the money. And when you look at what the 30 Years' War did to every country that got involved in it, you've 6 million casualties in 30 years, which is an unheard of statistic when the population was so much smaller. I think, yes, we would have avoided the Civil War, but only because we were so exhausted from the 30 Years' War. But the question also of, would that have meant the monarchy fell in the 18th century or the 19th if it hadn't gone through the lessons it learned because of the Civil War and the Glorious Revolution, and its sort of proud transformation into the most successful constitutional monarchy. It one of the keys to Britain's survival is that it got there earlier, and it has had time to perfect its constitutionalism. Whereas many of the others had to be dragged kicking and screaming. Denmark was another one that still has a monarchy, went peacefully towards it. And so, yeah, I think you can make a case both in short and long term. The death of Henry in 1612 was one of, if not the most impactful. Probably, yeah, I could. He certainly deserves to be in the top three.
William Atheling would be my choice, only
Yeah,
because of the anarchy and the
yeah, yeah,
power of the Angevin Empire that came after it. But I mean, yeah,
yeah.
you could make a heck of a lot of
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the other one, I mean, the other one is a baby, which is the Duke of Cornwall in 1511, which is of Henry VIII that had a son with his first wife, or with his second, more arguably with his first, would the whole Reformation not have happened in England? Who knows?
See, that's the book we should write
Yeah,
together. You can
absolutely.
be in
Good one.
big print. Just put me at the
Yeah,
bottom.
no, no. Fair is fair, 50-50, I think it has to be in the title page.
Ably assisted by. That's what you can put for me. Ably assisted by. We had so much to talk about and so much we didn't get a chance to talk about. But I would like you to do me a favor before we break. And that is, would you say hello to my friend Molly Dewberry, who's the
Yes.
Deputy Chief of Staff, the Indiana Governor, Mike Braun. She is a phenomenal lover of history, especially this time period. I told her that you were coming on the podcast, and she had just ordered your book from the
Uh-huh.
library, and she just ordered your book also from the Indianapolis Library about Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, which I told her is
Okay.
fabulous. So if you could just say
Oh, that's
hi,
fine.
Molly, thank you for reading.
Well, that's very good. Molly Jabari is a great name as well, nice and French with the connotations. But hello, Molly. It is a pleasure to meet you through the medium of the podcast, and I hope you enjoy the books.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana based public relations enterprise. We are also a federally certified, veteran owned small business. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of the great Scott P.E. McAllister. Our guest today, Gareth Russell, his fourth time on the podcast. We simply are humbled and thrilled that you keep coming on to the podcast. Today, we discussed his book, The Six Loves of James the First. Gareth, I love your writing.
Thank
I'm
you.
awed by your brilliance. You obviously work the living hell out of these archives. And so God bless you and your
Thank
asthma
you.
for everything that you do. Please keep writing and please keep coming back on the podcast.
Anytime. It is genuinely a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.